Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
I've entitled this case The Ripple Effect, and we'll get in more of why I entitled that towards the end of our podcast. But MD, take it away.
Stephanie Reed was born on August 1st, 1969, and her family spent their formative years in a housing project on the vibrant south side of Chicago. Now, as the eldest of four siblings, she naturally took on the role of nurturer and big sister, and I get that. I understand that being a big sister myself. And so she always lended a helping hand where needed. She was intelligent and athletic, and she excelled in her studies. And she also had a passion for sports. After graduating in 1987, Stephanie embraced motherhood, welcoming a daughter into her life. And although her marriage was short-lived, the bond that she maintained with her daughter remained strong and loving. As a single mother, Stephanie found employment in customer service, which is where her determination and work ethic propelled her up the career ladder. She devoted herself to providing a stable life for her and her daughter, which, Steph, I think most single mothers, find themselves having to do for their families. She embraced the balance of work and parenthood, and she did that with a sense of grace. In 2005, when her daughter was a teenager, Stephanie began dating again. And this time it was with a guy named JD Amason, affectionately known as JD. Their chemistry was immediately palpable, igniting a spark of happiness in Stephanie's world after years of just focusing on her daughter and making a life for them. However, the initial joy of their romance was soon overshadowed when JD lost his job at a local furniture store, which plunged them into a deep depression. The once thriving relationship began to fray as both faced personal struggles. After 4 years together, they made the heartfelt decision to part ways, each hoping to rediscover their individual paths and happiness to their future.
December 12th, 2009, on the south side of Chicago, a landlord heard a loud noise. Upon leaving his home to investigate the origin of the sound, he saw someone leaving the apartment of his tenant. Concerned, he went to check on her. Her door was torn down, and inside he found her face down in her bedroom. He immediately called 911. The young lady was shot twice, once in the head and again in the chest. Police arrived on scene and secured it and began to collect forensics to solve this crime. The name of the tenant was 40-year-old Stephanie Reed. Now, Jeff, Stephanie's brother, walked over as he and his mother lived a short distance away from Stephanie's apartment. He asked the police what happened, what was going on, and the police can't give you too much information, but they did in fact tell him that Stephanie was deceased. He and the rest of his family, just a short distance away, were shocked with grief. Back on the scene where the crime occurred, they noticed that the gunman had entered the home via the front door. As I said before, the door was literally broken off of the hinges. They found inside of the apartment a 9mm casing, and immediately it looked like a robbery. Because why else would a perpetrator knock down a door? I just want y'all to think through this with me, because naturally they think it's a robbery, not because of anything specific that they found on scene, but to knock somebody's door off the hinges causes a lot of noise. So they think, well, obviously maybe this perpetrator was thinking she wasn't at home. That's why he tore down the door in such a horrendous manner. And then upon finding out that she was home, well, he shoots her but he doesn't have a chance to take any of the valuable items because he was shocked that she was there. Now, this is just the initial assumption that the police were making on scene. They go and talk to the landlord because they believe that the landlord may have some information to make them privy of the case. And he tells them that Stephanie was very low key, but there was a man that she was dating by the name of JD, but he hadn't seen him for a couple of weeks. And JD seemed very friendly, but he wasn't aware of any issues with Stephanie. So, police began to canvass the area for eyewitnesses or anybody who has any information regarding the shooting. However, they didn't find anything that related, at least not initially, because two witnesses actually came forward with information. They called 911 that same night. And they said as they were walking out of their apartment, it was actually two cousins. One was a male, one was a female. They were walking outside of their house, and a black sedan pulls up. And instinctively, when somebody pulls up on you, what do? You look inside the vehicle to see if you actually know them. And the driver leans out of the car and points a gun at their head. So they're shocked. The next thing that you do instinctively is put your hands up and say, hey, if you want some money, we got it. But the man said that he didn't want any money. So that gives them an opportunity to actually flee the scene and head back inside the house where they call 911. Now, they noticed as they were calling 911 to kind of give them some identifying factors that the black sedan was now pulled in front of Stephanie Reed's home. Now, police had to figure out, were these two incidents related? And after all, they didn't really know much about the perpetrator or the assumed perpetrator because the landlord did not get a good view of the perpetrator as he fled the scene.
After speaking to the witnesses, they talked to Stephanie's family and they inquired more about JD. They informed detectives that they were together for 4 years and then they broke up in October when she discovered that he wasn't being faithful. They needed to speak to JD in light of all of this information coming out. They put a bolo out for JD. However, little did they know that in Maywood, investigators in another county was also looking for JD. They recently received a phone call to dispatch claiming a man was shot. Several officers were dispatched to the scene, and James Johnson was shot, and his wife, Elaine, witnessed the shooting. She identified the man who shot her husband as her stepson, James, JD Amason. She informed the detective that her husband's relationship with his son, JD, was strained. James had 3 children, one with his wife, a daughter, and 2 boys by 2 other women. After the passing of JD's mother, he quit school after 8th grade and he became suicidal. His father wanted him to live with him, but instead, he decided he was going to live with his grandparents in 1995. JD was arrested for drug possession, kidnapping, carjacking, and armed robbery. He was incarcerated for almost 20 years. After getting out, he was trying to, rebuild and find himself, figure out what he was trying to do. So he was working consistently toward that, and he found a job and he was working. Then he met a woman named Tashika Smith, who he then married in 2003. And for 6 years, they were going well. Things were looking good. All was well within their relationship until 2009 when they separated. JD felt that Tashika was having him followed. And then soon after all of that, his mental awareness seemed altered.
Elaine explained that JD arrived at his parents' home and accused his father of sleeping with Tashika. He took out a gun and shot his father and informed Elaine if she said anything, he'd shoot her, and walked out of the house. But right before he left, he told her that Tashika was dead. They learned that Tashika lived in Stager, which was another county. Now, I'm just going to keep you guys up to date. The initial county was Chicago PD, which is also known as Cook County. Then you had Maywood County, and now we're in Stager County. So they contact the police to do a welfare check there in Stager County, but simultaneously, Maywood actually reaches out to Chicago PD to make them aware of the situation, that they were on the lookout, which is Bolo is be on the lookout. They were looking for JD. But in the midst of that, they were able to share information about both cases. And so they're trying to really put the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, Stager police arrived at Tashika's house and were able to gain entrance very quickly. They found her sadly laying on the couch covered by a purple sheet. They also find two children in the back bedrooms and they were asleep. They contact Tashika's sister to pick up the children. The cause of her death was asphyxiation due to strangulation, but they also noticed that her throat had been slit. Police believe that JD murdered Tashika and shot his father and was responsible for Stephanie's death. But I'm saying this as if it is, but at the time they were just doing their investigation and this was their well educated guess at the time. They realized that Tashika's Chevy Blazer was missing. However, this doesn't match the car that was seen by Stephanie's home, which was a black sedan, and her Chevy Blazer was actually blue. So they were trying to unravel this mystery. 3 police departments were on the hunt to find JD. But baby, when I tell you they could not find this man, they could not find this man. But what they did know now is that JD was living a double life. He was married to Tashika and seeing Stephanie for 4 years. Now, on December 12th, Maywood, Chicago PD, and Stager were still trying to track him down. Okay. So they're still on the hunt. But in the meantime, in between time, they questioned Tashika's family about the nature of her relationship with JD. The family informed investigators they had problems, significant problems, especially around the time when JD lost his job. And that should sound familiar to you guys because that was the downfall of he and Stephanie's relationship. So he was just trying to find ways to cope. He was smoking, he was drinking, but he kept thinking that Tashika was cheating on him, right? And also, she was having him followed. So, in the course of their marriage basically dismantled, the police were called several times to the home. Shortly before Tashika's death, they were in conversations about a divorce. But despite the relationship coming to an end, Tashika was very kind to JD. She knew he was having a hard time adjusting to the fact they were about to get divorced, and she needed to have a good co-parenting relationship with him. So she would allow him to borrow her car. And on December 11th, he actually borrowed her car, and Tashika's sister took her to work. But he promised to bring the car back home that evening. And she actually invited him in to have dinner. But this is a really good thing that police now know because it was just a theory that he killed Tashika, but now they know for sure he was the last person to see Tashika alive. They're able to put him on the scene of the crime. So while the police were there talking to Tashika's family, they received a call from dispatch. And this is where you say, Steph, what else can you tell me? Well, dun, 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 dun. It was a woman named Terry Williams. She said that JD was her boyfriend and that he had taken her car, and she was scared that he was going to come back and kill her. So the police, they're just trying to get their head around this, but they have to act quickly, right? Because JD is still out in Chicago, and who knows who he's going to kill next. So they arrive at her home and they find Terry. She's with her son. She's terrified. So she explains that her and James had been in an off and on again relationship. And during that time, they conceived a child together, which was the son that she was carrying in her arms when police arrived. Now, they conceived this child when he was married.
We have James, who was married to Tashika, and James was convinced that Tashika was having an affair with his father. He strangles Tashika and shoots his father. He was in a relationship with Stephanie and with Terry. Now, Terry claimed she had no idea that he was married until she had conceived her child. However, after finding out, she did continue the relationship in hopes that, she could keep the relationship together, keep the family together, right? And then she said that JD stopped by the house at 9:30 p.m. and nothing was out of the ordinary. Like he was coming over, he was spending time with his son, and then she decides to go to sleep, right? And after waking up, her son was sleeping in his bed. So then a relative called and said that James shot his father. So she finds out from one of her family members that James shot his father in the neck. Her black sedan was missing, and its place was Tashika's Chevy Blazer. She then called police. He went to the home with the intention of switching the vehicles, and they asked Terry if she knew Stephanie Reed. And Terry then admitted that she did receive a call from a woman named Stephanie who informed her that she and JD were in a relationship for 4 years. Now, Terry informed her that JD was married, which led her to end the relationship between Stephanie and JD. Right? So want to make sure we're all clear, right? She calls Terry to tell Terry, hey, I'm in a relationship with this guy that you're in a relationship with, and we've been together for 4 years. And Terry's like, well, hey, did you know that he was married? As Stephanie was like, no, but I got you, and I'm gonna end this relationship that I got with this man because I don't have time for that. Right? Now, despite his relentless pursuit, instantly Terry tells the police that they need to warn Stephanie. However, she didn't know. It was too late. It was too little too late. She knew, like, when the police were over there talking to her and she finds out all this information about Tashika being dead, the father being dead, she understood this guy needs to be stopped, and you guys probably need to go get Stephanie. But they had to inform her that Stephanie had already been murdered. Now, before daybreak, in a Southside gentleman's club, a man had tried to enter without paying. He brandished a handgun, and they went ahead and let him in. And of course, I know y'all are out there and y'all like, this must be JD, and it was JD. And he had became a problem for anyone who entered his path. He was just kind of like on a frenzy. Club security descends on him, and there was an exchange of gunfire. They shoot him in the leg, and he was sent to a nearby hospital and rolled into surgery. When he gets out of surgery on December 13th, police finally were able to try to get some answers, or try to, attempt to get some answers. So all the detectives from the various counties, because there were multiple counties involved in their pursuit of JD, interviewed him, and he waived his rights, and he decided he was going to talk. JD believed no one was innocent. He stated that his closet contained many DVDs that supported his claim about his father and Tashika having an affair. Now, he claimed that there was a plot to kill him, and he stuck a recorder in Tashika's pocket and overheard some murder plot, and her and Stephanie, for his life insurance policy.
On December 11th, he claimed that he waited for his children to go to sleep after arriving back at Tashika's house to drop off the car and having dinner. And he confronted Tashika about the affair and the murder plot. He chose to strangle her instead of shooting her to avoid the children waking up. Then he went to the kitchen, grabbed a steak knife, and slit her throat because he felt that she was plain dead, and he had to ensure that she was indeed dead. He then leaves Tashika's home in her car and goes to Terry's house, where he swaps cars to purposely mislead the police. He then went to his father's house, and he never expressed remorse as he was retelling this story. But as he was telling the story about his father, police informed him, actually, you didn't kill your father. Your father's actually alive. And he was furious. He actually asked the police, he said, hey, can you just let me go kill him real quick? And I'll come back and I'll just turn myself in. Like, it won't be a big deal, but I have to kill him. After he realized that the police were not going to let him go, he continued to tell his story. And he said that Stephanie Reed was obviously plotting to kill him. And his behavior at this time was so irrational that he broke down her door and he shot her in the chest. She begged for her life, but he shot her in the head and he left. He went to the gentleman's club because he believed his boss, probably that boss that fired him, was there because he frequented that spot. But once he realized that his boss wasn't there, he said, well, you know what? I needed some money, so I just decided to like stick up the place. Right. So he was charged with 2 murder attempts and also attempted murder for his father's injuries. And he was charged with armed robbery of the gentleman's club. JD's father was left paralyzed from the neck down. Now, police were unable to substantiate those DVDs that JD said were in his closet that proved that his father was indeed having an affair with Tashika. They never found those. And they never found a recording of Tashika and Stephanie plotting his murder. And they never found those things because Tashika and Stephanie didn't even know each other. James Johnson, however, eventually died from his injuries, and he picked up an additional murder charge.
So on June 25th, 2012, JD stood trial for all murder cases. Now, keep in mind, it was 3 different counties, okay? But they all cooperated and worked together. Prosecutors believe that JD had executed his plan to kill his father and the women, plus his boss. And he enacted an intentional plan and continued until he was caught. His defense team argued that he was guilty by reason of insanity. Now, mental health experts said that he was suffering from some sort of paranoid personality disorder, hallucinations, and paranoia. Prosecutors, however, contended that his actions were methodical and criminal, not indicative of a mental health disorder. On June 28th, 4 hours later, he was convicted of all 3 murders and armed robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no victory for any families in his conviction.
That is the case of Tashika Smith, Stephanie Reed, and his father, James. My takeaway, I have 2 things that I want to mention to you guys. We often hear about the ripple effect and how that goes, and we think about it in terms of trauma. At least I do. I relate it to trauma because one action then produces several ripples, as you see when you throw a rock in a pond. And I've talked about the ripple effect here, so I won't spend too much time on what that effect is. However, it just reminds me that you sometimes never see things coming. And when we talk about takeaways, reflections, and trying to glean something from a case, we often discuss about what could they have done different. And unfortunately, none of these women or his father could have done anything different. And it exposes the vulnerabilities that we all have, that you can do certain things, you can trust certain people, but you can still remain vulnerable. And I think we need to be aware of those vulnerabilities because oftentimes in true crimes, I think we're trying to nitpick and figure out where they went wrong. And there are just some cases where nobody did anything wrong. Like somebody actually enacted evil upon their lives. But this vulnerability and the whole theory of the ripple effect, I think also brings into play mental illness. Because when you talk about this case, you have to talk about mental illness. It obviously was there. And while I can't confirm that he had a mental illness, I think the fact that we're able to get a quick snapshot of what happened in his childhood after losing his mother and how he had suicidal ideations. And even his sister, who was interviewed, said, I will admit that I think our family missed some red flags. We knew there was something off. We knew that there was something going on, but I think we missed some things. What I want to expose is that when you see mental issues within family members, especially in childhood, because I think that's probably at a level where you can do more versus an adult who can be like, no, and go on their own way. I think that you really do have to get some tools, get some therapy, and try to seek treatment. Because I think at several different places in his life, you could pinpoint where he clearly went off rails when his mother died. Then again, when he lost his job and his sense of stability. Who knows what happened to him in prison? And we know that that is no excuse to kill anybody. However, I do think those are factors that we can look at and say, you know what? If we do see red flags, in this case, in terms of mental health, we do need to seek treatment as best as we can, especially in childhood. So that is my takeaway. I'm curious to know what you guys think about this case, especially because there were so many turns and twists and turns where you think Stephanie just broke up with him because of this, but then his father was involved, and you're just trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together, much like the detective. So, MD, do you have any thoughts about this case as well?
The only thing that I'll add, Steph, because I do love how you talked about the mental illness aspect of this, and I think oftentimes, as a layperson, you may not understand what the legal insanity, like what the legal standard is as it relates to criminal law. Like, so you can literally have a mental illness and not necessarily be legally insane, right? Because legal insanity, it involves some sort of mental illness, but it's not the same as a clinical diagnosis. The legal standard focuses on the defendant's ability to understand the law and the consequences of their actions, and not necessarily that you're schizophrenic or that you're bipolar, right? Like, or whatever, you have suicidal ideations. It's more about, does the defendant understand that what he is doing is wrong and there's consequences to those actions? And so it's an affirmative defense that's used to argue that the defendant should not be held criminally responsible due to their mental illness because they did not understand that what they were doing was wrong, right? And so, as you're thinking through that, when it comes to this case or any other case that involves some sort of like mental illness, that's the standard by which the law is holding that particular defendant. And that defendant carries the burden of proof to prove that he's not insane. And they use that by getting a psychiatrist. And in this case, they had someone that came on and said, yeah, he did have some paranoia, he did have some hallucinations. But what you didn't hear was that he had an inability to understand what was right from wrong.
Yeah, that's pivotal. And I think it's always, I'm a definitions person. So it's good to know the definition in which you should see it, because as you said, we often have our own definition of mental insanity looks like. And, he just didn't fit that. MD, you talked about last week about the case here in Frisco, and there is an update about Carmelo Anthony. As of today, Carmelo Anthony and his attorneys went in and they asked for a reduction in bail. His bail bond was $1 million, and it was reduced to $250,000. He is now out. I saw him walk out of the court today.
Yes. So his defense attorneys argued that, he should have a reduction in bail. And a lot of their argument was centered on the fact that he is not a danger to society, that he has no previous criminal history. Basically, these are factors that the judge is going to consider. The severity of the offense, what's the defendant's financial situation? Does he have the ability to just up and leave and move to another country? Like, is he a risk flight, right? What is his ties to the community, his criminal history? Again, is he a risk flight? Those are the considerations that they're considering. I do personally believe that the bail was an extremely high, like what they put $1 million for this particular defendant was extremely high in light of those factors that I'm telling you that the judge is going to consider. So I think that the judge in this case made the right decision by reducing his bail. So he is at home. He is on house arrest, and he has a monitor that's monitoring him and his movement. And so that's the update. Steph, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this case, to me in particular, is just very interesting. And I think there is room to hear the entire story. And so, as you mentioned last week, that's why I was hesitant to say anything, like, just because we don't know. And when you don't know, you can't have a good conversation or a well-rounded conversation surrounding it. And so because we don't know, I do think he deserves to go through the legal system and have all that is afforded to him. So reduction in bail, that sounds right to me, you know. And so I think we just have to keep watching and waiting. But I think we have to be fair in how we're even judging the waiting time in which we're doing it.
I think that's right. And so, we will continue to keep you guys abreast on, this situation. Maybe even next time, Steph, we can debunk some of the gossip and the rumors that are out there, because it's a lot. And I just think it's so important that we do not perpetuate rumors and gossip. Like, wait for the facts. And that should be for anybody on the side of whatever it is. Put yourself in the shoes of both the victim and try to put yourself in the shoes of the suspect, right? How would you, and then if you can't do it, put your child in those shoes. How would you want things to unfold if it were you? Right? What would be fair, and what would you consider to be fair if you were on in those shoes?
Right. Right. You gotta, I think, choose kindness in all aspects. So we are wanting to know what you think about this particular case that we covered this week. I asked that you guys, if you are on YouTube, we're going to be expanding and doing more video content. And by video content, I mean more interaction. So that may mean simple, you're seeing MD and I tell the case, or you may be seeing, as we're talking about the case, we're featuring pictures. We've done that as MD and I are like actively, you can see us talking, and then you can also interact with our content. So we are just trying to expand. So go and subscribe on YouTube for us, okay? And also just support us overall. Leave a review, share if you care this episode with friends and family. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.